Studies have shown that one of the most defining traits of narcissism is actually the self-serving bias. We all have experienced a self-serving bias at some point in time, be we conscious or unconscious of it. Maybe it's from a close friend, maybe a coworker, maybe a significant other, family member, teacher, student. Though the self-serving bias is a defining characteristic of narcissism, it doesn't mean that everyone with this trait is a narcissist. In fact, only about 5% of the world population is actually narcissistic. So you don't have to worry about that. It's a very small number. Yet, we all have displayed this trait to some extent, or at least we know somebody who has. This trait is especially evident amongst young children. And if you don't think you know anybody at all, certainly our former president, Donald Trump, displayed a lot of it.
I like President Xi a lot. I think he's a friend of mine. He may not be a friend of mine anymore, but I think he probably respects, from what I hear, if you look at Mr. Pillsbury, the leading authority on China, he was on a good show, I won't mention the name of the show, recently, and he was saying that China has total respect for Donald Trump and for Donald Trump's very, very large brain.
So what we're going to do today is we're going to learn what the self-serving bias is and how to avoid its pitfalls. I'm going to define what the self-serving bias is, the two primary factors that fuel it, and finally, how we can work to become self-conscious of it. So, in an article called An Investigation of the Self-Serving Bias, published by the University of Georgia, they define the self-serving bias as a self-serving attribution that occurs when negative personal outcomes are ascribed to external circumstances and when positive outcomes are ascribed to internal factors. Now, that's pretty hard to understand. The Webster Dictionary has a better definition. Webster Dictionary defines a self-serving bias as serving one's own interest often in disregard of the truth or the interests of others. See, the self-serving bias works as a defense mechanism for self-image, our self-esteem, our ego. And when we do something and we're successful at it, we credit ourselves for putting forth the necessary effort to achieve the success. But when we fail at certain tasks, we look towards outward factors. We search for outward factors, and we use them to justify why we failed. Though this might seem a bit harmless, right? This can distort our perception of reality and can have unwanted consequences in relationships, and even in work relationships, and even our personal relationships. Now, in another study called Exploring Causes of the Self-Serving Bias by the University of Florida, they listed two factors that fuel the self-serving bias. One, self-enhancement, and number two, self-presentation. This study described the self-enhancement as motivation to sustain or enhance one's sense of self. In other words, when we perceive ourselves as being responsible for a positive outcome in an event such as a competition, maybe a group project, our self-worth increases. Self-presentation, on the other hand, refers to the drive to convey a desired image to others. Now, this largely ties into our need to fit in. And given these two factors, you can see why the self-serving bias can be so powerful in influencing our behavior. And it's certainly something that we need to be aware of. So, how do we become conscious of the self-serving bias? Well, first, we must understand that the function of the self-serving bias is to defend our self-image, our self-esteem, essentially. Once we understand this, we must become aware of our reactions to situations that may trigger the self-serving bias. For instance, If the teacher gives you a low grade in this assignment, instead of blaming the teacher, take a moment to revise the expectations that were set and weigh accordingly, right? So essentially, you just need to become more self-aware of yourself, right? And then the other thing is we need to allow ourselves to become introspective and accept criticism. Once we do this, we will understand that sometimes we can be blind to certain aspects of ourselves. In closing, we learned what the self-serving bias is. It's two main driving factors and what we can do to become more aware of this trait. As Les Brown once said, you can't see the picture when you're in the frame. Thank you for watching.